The clock at Atlanta Union Station read 3:47 p.m. when David Patterson's phone buzzed for the third time in 5 minutes. Sarah Mitchell, 45, stood beside her husband clutching 2 train tickets to Savannah, watching his face transform from mild irritation to complete panic as he read the message. She had no idea this would be the moment that would change her entire life. Before we dive into what happened next, let me ask you something. How many of you watching right now have ever felt invisible in your own life? Like you've spent so many years taking care of everyone else that you've forgotten who you actually are. If that sounds familiar, then Sarah's story is going to resonate with you in ways you might not expect. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly through the station's glass ceiling, and Sarah could feel sweat beginning to form beneath her carefully chosen outfit. They were supposed to catch the 4:15 train to Savannah for her sister Emma's 25th wedding anniversary celebration, a weekend Sarah had been looking forward to for months. Their weekend bags sat loaded on the platform cart beside them, everything perfectly organized as always. "Victoria needs me at the office immediately," David announced, not looking up from his phone. "There's some crisis with the Morrison account, and she specifically requested me to handle it." His voice carried that familiar tone of self-importance that had become increasingly common over the past 3 years, ever since he'd started working directly under Victoria Sterling, the most demanding executive at Sterling and Associates. Sarah had learned to recognize that tone. It meant her plans were about to be sacrificed on the altar of David's career advancement. "David, we can't miss Emma's celebration," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm despite the frustration building in her chest. "She's counting on us. You promised her you'd be there, especially since Dad can't travel anymore after his stroke." The weight of that promise hung between them. Sarah's father's recent stroke had left him unable to make the trip, making their presence even more significant for her family. David had specifically assured Emma that he would be there to help with the anniversary toast, to stand in as the family patriarch for this important milestone. He finally looked up from his phone, but his eyes held no warmth, only that calculating look she'd grown to dread. "Sarah, you don't understand how important this account is to my career. Victoria chose me specifically because she trusts my judgment. This could be the breakthrough I've been waiting for." His voice dropped to that patronizing tone she'd learned to despise. "Besides, it's just an anniversary party. You can handle your family for one weekend." Just an anniversary party. The dismissive way he reduced her sister's 25-year milestone, something that represented the kind of lasting love and commitment Sarah had once believed she had in her own marriage, hit her like a physical blow. These were the people who had welcomed David with open arms from the moment they started dating 20 years ago, who had included him in every holiday and celebration, who had supported his career moves even when it meant Sarah had to give up opportunities of her own. Now he spoke of them like they were strangers whose concerns barely registered on his radar. "This isn't some casual gathering, David," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. "Emma specifically asked us to be there. She's been planning this for months, and with Dad's condition." She paused, trying to find the right words. "This might be one of the last big family celebrations he's truly present for." "Look, I don't have time to argue about this," David interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "You're being emotional and unreasonable. Take the train, go to your family thing, and I'll catch up tomorrow if I can. Victoria said this might take all night, but if we nail this presentation, it could mean a promotion to partner." The casual way he reduced her family's celebration to a family thing while elevating his boss's last-minute demands to life-changing importance crystallized something that had been building for years. Sarah thought about all the dinners cut short because Victoria called all the weekend plans canceled because she needed David to review documents, all the times he'd chosen her approval over their marriage without a second thought. And now, if you're watching this and thinking Sarah should have just gone along with it, kept the peace like she always did, I want you to hold that thought. because what happened next changed everything. "You're choosing her again," Sarah said quietly, the words carrying more weight than she'd intended. "You're choosing Victoria over me, over us, over commitments you made to people who love you." David's jaw tightened and she saw something cold flash in his eyes. "I'm choosing my career over drama, Sarah. There's a difference. Maybe if you understood what it takes to succeed in a competitive field, you'd support me instead of guilt-tripping me about some party." Some party. Her sister's silver anniversary, her father's potentially last major family gathering, her family's need for support during an emotional time, all reduced to a trivial social event that couldn't compete with his boss's demands. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a foundation cracking under too much pressure. For 20 years, she had made herself smaller so David could shine brighter. She had given up her own career in landscape architecture, a field she'd been passionate about, to support his climb up the corporate ladder. She had moved cities when his job required. It had entertained his colleagues when he needed to network, had managed their entire domestic life so he could focus entirely on impressing Victoria Sterling. And for what? To stand in a train station being told that her family's milestone celebration was an inconvenience to his career trajectory. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Go to Victoria, handle your crisis, be the indispensable employee she apparently needs you to be." Relief flooded David's face so quickly that it revealed how little internal conflict he'd actually experienced. "Thank you for understanding. I knew you'd see reason once you thought about it logically." He leaned forward to kiss her cheek, but Sarah stepped back slightly, creating distance between them. "I said fine, David. I didn't say I understood." But he was already pulling out his phone again, fingers flying across the screen as he typed what was presumably an eager response to Victoria. "I'll call you tonight after the meeting. Have fun with your family and tell Emma I'm sorry I couldn't make it." The apology was perfunctory, delivered without even looking at her as he lifted his bag from their cart. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Back to the office. Victoria's sending a car to pick me up outside." He finally looked at her again, and Sarah was struck by how little regret she saw in his expression. "You'll be fine, Sarah. You're always fine." Those words would echo in her mind for months afterward. "You're always fine," as if her adaptability to his choices was a character trait rather than a survival mechanism, as if her ability to handle disappointment was something to be counted on rather than protected. Sarah watched him disappear into the crowd of commuters, his expensive briefcase swinging at his side and his phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, she could see the animation in his posture as he spoke presumably to Victoria, arranging his immediate return to serve her needs. The enthusiasm he showed for pleasing his boss stood in stark contrast to the reluctant obligation he displayed when discussing her family's celebration. The platform around her continued its usual chaos. Travelers checking schedules, families gathering for journeys, couples coordinating their movements. The normalcy of it all made David's abandonment feel even more surreal. How could the world continue its regular rhythm when her marriage had just revealed itself to be a hollow shell? She stood there for several minutes staring at the spot where he'd disappeared, trying to process what had just happened. Her husband had chosen his boss's approval over his wife's needs, his career advancement over his family commitments, his individual ambition over their partnership. More than that, he'd done it without apparent internal struggle, as if the choice had been obvious and her objections unreasonable. The 4:15 train to Savannah was now boarding, and Sarah mechanically gathered her bag and walked toward the platform. Emma was expecting her, depending on her to represent their family, with Dad's absence already casting a shadow over the celebration. She couldn't let David's choices compound the disappointment her family was already facing. As she settled into her seat and watched Atlanta disappear through the window, Sarah felt a strange mixture of hurt anger and something else she couldn't quite identify yet. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Can't wait to see you and David. Thank you both for being here when Dad can't. It means everything to me." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Looking forward to seeing you too. David had a work emergency and will try to join us tomorrow." She couldn't bring herself to admit the full extent of his abandonment. Not yet. Some part of her still hoped he might surprise her, might realize what he'd done, and find a way to make it right. But as the train carried her toward Savannah and away from the man she'd thought she knew, Sarah began to understand that this moment wasn't an aberration, it was a revelation. David hadn't suddenly become someone who prioritized his boss over his wife. He'd always been that person, and she'd simply been too accommodating, too understanding, too willing to make excuses for him to see it clearly. And ladies, if you're watching this and thinking about your own relationships, about the times you've made yourself smaller to make someone else feel bigger, I want you to keep watching. Because Sarah's story is just beginning, and what she does next is going to surprise everyone, including herself. The train pulled away from Atlanta Union Station, carrying Sarah toward a celebration of lasting love while leaving behind a marriage that was already over. She just didn't know it yet. For 20 years, Sarah Mitchell had been slowly disappearing. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too dramatic for someone who prided herself on being reasonable and supportive. Instead, she had faded gradually, like a photograph left too long in the sun, until the vibrant woman who had once dreamed of transforming landscapes into works of art had become little more than a shadow in her own life. If you're just joining us, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because Sarah's story is one that too many women know all too well. And if this resonates with you, I want you to know you're not alone. The train to Savannah gave Sarah time to think, something she realized she hadn't done in years. Her days had become so structured around David's needs, his schedule, his career demands, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have uninterrupted time with her own thoughts. As the Georgia countryside rolled past her window, memories began surfacing. Memories of who she'd been before she became Mrs. David Patterson. She'd met David during her final semester of graduate school, where she was completing her master's degree in landscape architecture. Those had been exhilarating days filled with passion for sustainable design practices and excitement about creating beautiful spaces that also respected environmental principles. Her thesis project had focused on urban renewal through green spaces, transforming abandoned lots in downtown Charlotte into vibrant community gardens that brought neighbors together while cleaning the air and managing stormwater runoff. Sarah had been good at it. More than good, she'd been exceptional. Her professors had praised her innovative approach to combining aesthetic beauty with ecological function. She'd received job offers from 3 different firms upon graduation, each presenting opportunities to grow her expertise in different aspects of environmental design. But David had just landed his entry-level position at Sterling and Associates, and the demands of his role were intense. He worked long hours, traveled frequently for client meetings, and needed emotional support as he navigated the competitive world of corporate consulting. It had seemed natural, loving even, for Sarah to take a more flexible position that would allow her to accommodate his schedule. She'd chosen Henderson and Associates, a smaller firm with less prestigious projects but more reasonable hours. "It's temporary," she'd told herself, "just until we both get established." Temporary had somehow become permanent as David's responsibilities grew and his salary increased, while Sarah's career remained static. The pattern had been so gradual that she'd barely noticed it happening. First, she'd started leaving work early when David had important client dinners, making sure their apartment was perfect and dinner was ready so he could decompress from his stressful day. Then she'd begun declining after-work networking events, because David needed her to be available for his increasingly frequent business entertaining. When Sterling and Associates offered David a promotion that required relocating to Charlotte, Sarah had left her job without hesitation. "It's a great opportunity for us," David had said, and she'd believed him. The us had felt real then, like they were building something together. But in Charlotte, Sarah had found herself in a different kind of isolation. David's new role came with longer hours and more travel, leaving her alone in a city where she knew no one. She tried to restart her career, but the gap in her resume raised questions, and the landscape architecture firms in Charlotte were smaller, more traditional, less interested in the innovative environmental approaches that had once excited her. Eventually, she'd taken a part-time position with a residential design company, creating pleasant but uninspiring gardens for wealthy homeowners who wanted beauty without challenging their conventional ideas about what landscapes should look like. It paid enough to contribute to their household expenses, but it felt like playing it safe after years of dreaming big. Meanwhile, David's career had soared. His natural charisma and analytical mind made him a favorite among Sterling and Associates' demanding clientele. He'd moved up quickly, taking on bigger accounts and more responsibility. And 3 years ago, he'd been assigned to work directly under Victoria Sterling, the firm's most powerful executive. Sarah had met Victoria exactly once at the company's annual holiday party. She was everything Sarah wasn't. Sharp-edged, immaculately dressed, completely focused on business, with no apparent interest in small talk or pleasantries. She was also beautiful in an intimidating way, with the kind of polished sophistication that made other women feel underdressed by comparison. "So, you're David's wife," Victoria had said when they were introduced, looking Sarah up and down, with an expression that seemed to find her somehow lacking. "David's told me so much about you." The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but Sarah had left with the distinct impression that Victoria Sterling saw her as an inconvenience, someone whose needs might interfere with David's total dedication to his work. That impression had proven accurate. From the moment David began working directly under Victoria, Sarah's life had become a series of interrupted plans and last-minute changes. Dinners cut short because Victoria called with an urgent question. Weekend plans canceled because she needed David to review documents. Vacations postponed because she'd scheduled mandatory strategy sessions during the time they'd requested off. "She's incredibly demanding," David would say, but he said it with a tone of admiration rather than complaint. "She has the highest standards of anyone I've ever worked with. If you can succeed under Victoria Sterling, you can succeed anywhere." Sarah had tried to be understanding. She knew David's career was important, not just for his own satisfaction, but for their financial security. Her part-time work brought in modest income, but David's salary was what allowed them to live in their nice apartment, to take vacations, to feel financially secure in a way that Sarah's parents' generation had never quite achieved. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Evenings spent alone while David worked late at the office. Weekends interrupted by urgent calls from Victoria. Social events where Sarah attended alone because David had a work crisis that required his immediate attention. The worst part was how normal it had all become. Sarah had stopped making plans that couldn't be canceled. She'd stopped expecting David to be present for things that mattered to her. She'd learned to smile and make excuses when friends asked where her husband was, to deflect questions about why he missed family gatherings, to present a united front, even when she felt anything but united. She'd become an expert at being understanding, at being flexible, at being fine with whatever arrangements David's career demanded. The woman who had once designed innovative solutions to complex environmental problems had become someone whose primary skill was adapting to other people's decisions. And now, as the train carried her toward her sister's anniversary celebration, Sarah was confronting the full cost of all that adaptation. When had she stopped talking about landscape architecture with passion? When had she stopped dreaming about the projects she might create? When had she begun measuring her success by how well she supported David's ambitions, rather than by her own professional growth? The anniversary celebration in Savannah was everything Sarah had hoped it would be. Warm, joyful, filled with family and friends who had prioritized Emma's happiness over their own convenience. Sarah found herself watching her sister and brother-in-law Tom throughout the evening, noting the way they moved together with the easy synchronization of people who had spent 25 years truly partnering with each other. During the toasts, Tom spoke about Emma with genuine admiration for her accomplishments as a teacher, her role in their community, her individual dreams and goals. "I'm not just married to Emma," he said, raising his glass. "I'm married to the most interesting, talented, accomplished woman I know. She makes me better, but more importantly, I hope I make her better too." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized how long it had been since David had spoken about her with that kind of admiration. How long since he'd even seemed to see her as an individual with her own dreams and accomplishments. Her phone remained conspicuously silent throughout the celebration. No calls from David checking on the event, no texts asking how her family was doing, no acknowledgement that he might have made the wrong choice. The absence of communication spoke volumes about how he viewed the situation. In his mind, he'd made a reasonable business decision, and Sarah's feelings about it were secondary to the practical reality of advancing his career. After the formal celebration ended, Sarah found herself walking in the historic Savannah squares with her cousin Lisa, a woman who had built her own successful law practice after a difficult divorce 10 years earlier. Lisa had been watching Sarah throughout the evening with the perceptive eyes of someone who recognized the signs of a woman losing herself in someone else's ambitions. "You know, Sarah," Lisa said gently, "there's a difference between supporting someone's dreams and disappearing into them." She paused beside one of Savannah's famous fountain squares, the Spanish moss creating intricate shadows in the evening light. "I spent years of my marriage believing that being a good wife meant making myself smaller so my husband could shine brighter. It took me far too long to realize that the right partner wants you to shine just as brilliantly as they do." Lisa's words hit Sarah with unexpected force. "David's career is just more demanding right now," she heard herself saying, the automatic defense she'd perfected over years of explaining his choices to others and to herself. "Once he gets more established, things will balance out." Lisa smiled sadly. "Sweetheart, I said the same thing for 12 years. The goalpost just keeps moving. First, it was getting established, then it was making partner, then it was landing the biggest clients. There's always another milestone that requires sacrifice, and somehow it's always your sacrifice being requested, never his." That night alone in her hotel room, Sarah stared at the ceiling and forced herself to confront some uncomfortable truths. When was the last time David had sacrificed something important to him for something important to her? When had he ever chosen her needs over his career advancement or Victoria's demands? She tried to think of examples, but came up empty. The pattern was clear once she stopped making excuses for it. In David's mind, his career was their priority, and her role was to facilitate that success through her flexibility and understanding. Her phone finally buzzed at 11:47 p.m. with a text from David. "Meeting ran late. Victoria really appreciated my input on the strategy. Hope the party went well. See you tomorrow night." No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd missed, no recognition that his choice had cost their relationship something valuable, just satisfaction with Victoria's appreciation and the assumption that Sarah would continue to be understanding and accommodating. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she found herself opening her laptop and for the first time in months, browsing landscape architecture websites and industry publications. She read about innovative, sustainable building projects, about designers who were pushing boundaries and creating meaningful change through their work. As she read, she felt a familiar stirring of excitement, a reminder of who she'd been before she'd molded herself around David's career trajectory. The woman who had once dreamed of transforming urban spaces into green sanctuaries was still there, buried under years of accommodation and compromise, but not gone. Ladies, if you're watching this and recognizing yourself in Sarah's story, I want you to know that this moment, this recognition, is where change begins. Not with dramatic gestures or confrontations, but with the quiet realization that you've been living someone else's life instead of your own. The next morning, Sarah woke up early and walked through Savannah's historic district, admiring the way the city's designers had integrated green spaces into urban planning. She found herself sketching in a notebook she'd brought along, documenting ideas for how similar principles could be applied to other cities. For the first time in years, she was thinking like a landscape architect again, rather than like David Patterson's supportive wife. The train ride back to Charlotte gave her more time to think. She realized that her marriage had become a performance. She played the role of the understanding wife, while David played the role of the ambitious executive, and neither of them was addressing the growing distance between their performed roles and their authentic selves. When she arrived home, David was already there working on his laptop in their living room. He looked up as she entered, offering a distracted smile. "How was Savannah?" he asked, but his eyes were already drifting back to his screen. "It was beautiful," Sarah replied. Emma and Tom seemed really happy. It was the kind of celebration that makes you think about what makes a marriage work. David nodded absently, clearly not catching the deeper meaning in her words. "That's nice. How's your dad doing?" "He's struggling with the effects of the stroke, but he was so grateful that family made the effort to be there for Emma." This time David did look up, and Sarah saw a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition of what his absence had meant. But it passed, quickly replaced by the familiar look of someone who had already moved on from yesterday's decisions. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it," he said. "But the crisis with Victoria turned out to be even bigger than we thought. We saved the Morrison account and she's considering me for a senior partnership track." Even his apology came with a justification, a reminder that his absence had been worthwhile because it had advanced his career. Sarah realized that David genuinely didn't understand that some things were more important than professional advancement, that relationships required presence, not just good intentions. "David," she said carefully, "when was the last time you chose me over work?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "That's not fair, Sarah. I work for us, for our future. Everything I do is building toward a better life for both of us." "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Or is it building toward a better life for you with me expected to be grateful for whatever benefits trickle down from your success?" The conversation that followed was their most honest in years, and it revealed the fundamental disconnect that had been growing between them. David genuinely believed that his career success was their shared success, that Sarah's role was to support and facilitate his ambitions, and that her own professional dreams were secondary to their financial security. Sarah tried to explain how she felt invisible in her own life, how she'd lost touch with her own passions and goals, how she needed to feel like an equal partner rather than a supporting character in his story. But David kept circling back to practical concerns: their mortgage, their lifestyle, the reality that his career offered more financial potential than hers ever could. "I don't understand why you're not happy," he said finally. "We have a good life, Sarah. We're financially secure. We live in a nice place. We have social status. What more do you want?" The question revealed everything that was wrong with their relationship. David couldn't conceive of happiness that wasn't tied to external success, couldn't understand that Sarah might need creative fulfillment, professional growth, or even just the simple recognition that her dreams mattered too. That night, after David had gone to bed, Sarah sat in their living room and really looked at their space for the first time in years. Everything reflected David's preferences: the modern furniture he'd chosen for its impression-making potential, the artwork selected to project sophistication to his colleagues, the layout arranged to accommodate his home office needs. Where was Sarah in any of this? Where were her preferences, her personality, her individual taste? She'd become so skilled at adapting to David's choices that she'd forgotten she was supposed to have choices of her own. The woman who had once designed innovative solutions to complex environmental problems had become someone whose primary skill was accommodating other people's decisions. But as she sat there in the pre-dawn quiet, Sarah began to understand that accommodation had its limits, and she was rapidly approaching hers. The seed of transformation had been planted in that train station in Atlanta. Now sitting in her own living room but feeling like a stranger in her own life, Sarah began to realize that the time for gradual change had passed. She was going to have to choose between continuing to disappear into David's ambitions or finding the courage to reclaim her own. What she chose to do next would surprise everyone, including herself. The breaking point came 3 weeks after Emma's anniversary celebration on a Tuesday evening that started like any other. Sarah had promised to attend her company's annual design showcase, an event she'd been preparing for months. It was the first time in 3 years that Henderson and Associates had selected one of her projects for prominent display, and she'd been genuinely excited to share this small professional victory with her husband. For those of you just joining us, make sure you subscribe because Sarah's journey is about to take a dramatic turn. And if you've ever felt like you've reached your breaking point, you'll understand exactly what happens next. Sarah had spent weeks perfecting her presentation on sustainable residential design, a project that transformed a dated 1970s suburban home into a modern, energy-efficient showcase that had already attracted inquiries from 5 other homeowners. The project represented everything she'd originally loved about landscape architecture, the perfect blend of aesthetic innovation and environmental responsibility. For the first time in years, she felt like the designer she'd once dreamed of becoming. David had circled this date on their calendar 6 weeks earlier, promising to leave work early so they could attend together. He'd even suggested they celebrate afterward at the new farm-to-table restaurant Sarah had been wanting to try, acknowledging that this recognition was important to her career development. She'd allowed herself to hope that maybe things were shifting, that perhaps he was beginning to understand the need for balance in their relationship. Sarah arrived home at 6:30 p.m. to find David still in his work clothes, frantically packing documents into his briefcase while talking rapidly on his phone. The familiar knot of disappointment began forming in her stomach as she recognized the signs of another Victoria emergency. He held up one finger to indicate he'd be with her momentarily, but his conversation continued for another 12 minutes while Sarah stood in their entryway, dressed for the showcase in her best professional attire. "Victoria needs me to fly to Jacksonville tonight," he announced after ending his call, not meeting her eyes as he continued stuffing papers into his bag. "The Henderson Group is threatening to pull their contract over some miscommunication, and she specifically requested that I handle the damage control. There's a flight leaving at 9:30. The casualness of his tone, as if this were merely a scheduling inconvenience rather than the abandonment of another commitment to her, sparked something dangerous in Sarah's chest. "David, the showcase starts in an hour. You promised you'd be there. I've been working toward this recognition for months." "I know, and I'm sorry," he said, but his apology felt rehearsed, automatic. "But this is bigger than a company presentation, Sarah. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar account that could make or break the quarter." He finally looked at her, and she saw no real conflict in his expression, just the mild frustration of someone explaining obvious priorities to someone too naive to understand them. Besides, you're perfectly capable of handling one evening on your own. Network with some people, talk about your project, represent yourself professionally. You don't need me there to validate your work." The phrase, "handle it on your own," echoed the train station abandonment, revealing a pattern Sarah could no longer ignore. In David's mind, she was always capable of handling disappointment, always flexible enough to accommodate his changing priorities, always understanding enough to put his career needs above her own emotional and professional requirements. "This isn't about capability, David," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "This is about partnership. This is about showing up for each other when it matters." She set down her purse and faced him directly. "When was the last time you chose me over Victoria? When was the last time you told her that you had prior commitments and couldn't drop everything to solve her problems?" His jaw tightened with irritation. "That's not fair, Sarah. Victoria is my boss, not my friend. I can't just tell her no when there's a legitimate business crisis. You're being unreasonable." "I'm being unreasonable?" The words came out louder than she'd intended. "I'm unreasonable for expecting my husband to honor his commitments to me. I'm unreasonable for wanting you to show up for my professional milestone the way I've shown up for every single one of yours. That's different, and you know it." David shot back, his own voice rising. "My career has actual financial implications for our future. Your design work is nice, but it's not exactly paying the bills around here." The dismissive cruelty of that statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her design work, the passion that had once defined her, the career she'd compromised repeatedly to support his ambitions, reduced to a nice hobby that didn't merit serious consideration. In that moment, she saw their entire relationship with devastating clarity. "Get out," she said quietly. David blinked clearly, not expecting that response. "What? Get out? Go to Jacksonville, handle Victoria's crisis, be the indispensable employee she apparently needs more than I need a husband." Sarah walked to their coat closet and pulled out his travel bag, setting it beside his briefcase. "But don't come back here expecting me to be grateful for the scraps of attention you throw my way when it's convenient." "Sarah, you're being dramatic. This is one evening." "This is not one evening." The words exploded out of her with months of suppressed frustration. "This is every evening, every weekend, every holiday, every commitment to me that gets sacrificed the moment Victoria calls. This is 3 years of making myself smaller so you can chase her approval." She gestured around their living room, seeing it clearly for the first time. "This is you missing my birthday dinner, skipping my company picnic, canceling our anniversary plans, all because your boss's needs always come first." David stared at her as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "My career is important, Sarah. I thought you understood that. I thought you supported my ambitions." "I did support them," Sarah replied, her voice breaking slightly. "I gave up job opportunities, social commitments, my own professional development to support them. But support was supposed to be mutual, David. Partnership was supposed to mean that we both mattered, that we both made sacrifices for each other's success and happiness." She walked to their bedroom and pulled his largest suitcase from the closet, setting it on their bed. "Take whatever you need for Jacksonville and whatever else you'll need for a while. You can stay at your brother's place or get a hotel room. I need time to think, and I need space from someone who sees my needs as optional." David followed her, his expression cycling between confusion and anger. "You're kicking me out over a work trip, Sarah. This is insane. Couples don't separate because of scheduling conflicts." "This isn't a scheduling conflict," Sarah said methodically, pulling his clothes from dresser drawers and placing them in the suitcase. "This is a fundamental incompatibility in how we view marriage and partnership. You see me as someone who should adapt to your choices. I need someone who sees me as someone worth making choices for." The finality in her voice seemed to register with him for the first time. He sat heavily on the edge of their bed, watching her pack his belongings with growing alarm. "Sarah, I love you. You know I love you. My work doesn't change that. Love isn't just a feeling, David, she replied, folding his shirts with mechanical precision. Love is a series of choices, a pattern of behavior, a commitment to prioritizing someone's well-being alongside your own. She focused on the task to avoid looking at his face. You may feel love for me, but you don't love me with your actions. You don't love me with your time, or your attention, or your choices. That's not true, he protested. I work hard for us for our future together. Everything I do is building toward a better life for both of us. Sarah stopped packing and turned to face him. Everything you do is building toward a better life for you. I'm just expected to be grateful for whatever benefits trickle down from your success. She gestured around their expensive apartment, furnished with items David had chosen based on how they would impress his colleagues. Look around, David. This is your life decorated with your preferences, organized around your schedule designed to support your ambitions. Where am I in any of this except as an accessory to your image? He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, perhaps finally seeing their living space through her eyes. The artwork he'd selected without consulting her, the furniture arranged to accommodate his home office, needs the social calendar built around his networking requirements. Sarah had become so accustomed to adapting to his choices that she'd stopped noticing how completely her own preferences had been erased. I never asked you to give up your own goals, he said weakly. You didn't have to ask, Sarah replied. You just made it clear that your goals were more important, more urgent, more worthy of sacrifice and compromise. And I was foolish enough to believe that if I supported you long enough, eventually you'd return the favor. David's phone buzzed with what was undoubtedly another message from Victoria about the Jacksonville situation. He glanced at it reflexively, and that unconscious prioritization of her communication over their conversation told Sarah everything she needed to know about where his true loyalties lay. Answer it, she said quietly. Handle whatever crisis she needs you to handle, but do it from somewhere else. He looked torn between responding to the message and continuing their conversation, but the pull of Victoria's demands proved stronger. Sarah, I have to take this. It's about the flight arrangements. I know you do, she replied, zipping up his suitcase. You always have to take her calls. That's exactly the problem. David spent 15 minutes on the phone with Victoria discussing strategy for the Jacksonville meetings, while Sarah finished packing his belongings. When he finally hung up, he found her waiting by the front door with his luggage, her face set, with a resolution that seemed to surprise him. Sarah, please, let's talk about this rationally when I get back. Don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. The condescending suggestion that her response was purely emotional rather than the result of months of careful observation infuriated her. I'm not emotional, David. I'm clear-headed for the first time in years. I'm seeing our relationship without the filter of hope that things will eventually change. Things can change, he insisted. I can find a better balance once this Jacksonville situation is resolved, once I get more established with Victoria's team. Give me a chance to prove that. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign that he truly understood what she was telling him, any indication that he grasped the fundamental problems in their dynamic. Instead, she saw the same pattern that had defined their relationship: promises of future change that would never require him to sacrifice anything in the present, assurances that her needs would matter once his more pressing concerns were addressed. I've given you 3 years of chances, David. I've accommodated, adapted, and adjusted my life around your career trajectory. I've been patient while you established yourself understanding, while you built your reputation supportive, while you impressed your supervisors. But patience and understanding have expiration dates, and mine has passed. David's phone buzzed again, and she watched him struggle not to look at it. The fact that he had to struggle, that Victoria's messages pulled at his attention even during the most serious conversation their marriage had ever faced, reinforced every point she'd been trying to make. Look at your phone, she said. Check her message. See what she needs now. Sarah, no. This conversation is more important. Check it, David, because we both know you want to, and we both know you'll be distracted until you do. And that distraction, that constant pull of her needs over mine, is why this marriage doesn't work anymore. Reluctantly, he glanced at his phone, and she saw his expression shift as he read Victoria's latest demand. Whatever she needed was urgent, time-sensitive, requiring his immediate attention and expertise, just like always. She needs me to review the contract amendments before the morning meeting, he said apologetically. It'll just take a few minutes. No, David. It won't take a few minutes. It'll take however long Victoria needs it to take, and then there will be another urgent task, and another and another. And I'll continue to wait for my turn to matter in your life, a turn that never actually comes. Sarah opened their front door and gestured toward the hallway. Go to Jacksonville. Save the account. Be the hero Victoria needs you to be. But don't expect me to continue playing the role of the understanding wife who's always fine with being second choice. David picked up his bags reluctantly, still seeming to believe that this was a temporary arrangement, a cooling-off period that would end with Sarah's usual accommodation to his choices. I'll call you when I land. We can figure this out, Sarah. We've been together too long to throw it all away over work stress. This isn't work stress, David. This is who you are. This is who we are together. And I finally realized that I deserve better than a marriage where I'm constantly competing with your boss for your attention and losing. After he left, Sarah stood in their suddenly quiet apartment and felt the strangest mixture of grief and relief. The silence felt different than the usual quiet of David working late or traveling for business. This silence belonged to her, reflected her choices, offered space for her thoughts without the constant background hum of his career demands. She called Henderson and Associates and left a message that she'd be attending the showcase alone, then changed into her most confident professional outfit and went to represent her work with pride. For the first time in months, she spoke about her design projects with genuine enthusiasm, networking with other professionals who shared her passion for sustainable innovation. Several people expressed interest in collaborating on future projects, and Sarah found herself exchanging business cards and making tentative plans for creative partnerships. The evening was successful in ways she hadn't anticipated. Without David's subtle redirections toward his own accomplishments, without his tendency to position himself as the more serious professional in their relationship, she was able to present herself authentically as a skilled designer with valuable expertise. The recognition felt earned rather than grudgingly granted, meaningful rather than obligatory. When she returned home that night, she didn't feel the usual emptiness of David's absence. Instead, she felt curious about what other aspects of her life might flourish if given space to grow without the constant shadow of his priorities. Sarah pulled out her old design portfolios, projects she'd completed before learning to dim her enthusiasm to avoid overshadowing David's achievements, and remembered the woman she'd been before she'd taught herself to be smaller. That woman was still there, buried under years of accommodation and compromise, but not gone. David called from Jacksonville the next morning, his voice strained with exhaustion and stress. The meetings with the Henderson group were going poorly. Victoria was demanding round-the-clock availability, and he needed to extend his trip indefinitely to salvage the account. He spoke about his situation as if Sarah would naturally sympathize with his difficulties, as if her role was to provide emotional support while he navigated his professional challenges. "I miss you," he said near the end of the call. "This whole situation has made me realize how much I depend on you being there when I come home." The phrasing struck Sarah as particularly revealing. He missed having her available when he needed emotional support, but there was no acknowledgement of what she might need from him, no recognition that his extended absence meant she was handling everything alone once again. "Take care of yourself, David. she said simply. Focus on what Victoria needs you to focus on. When I get back, we'll sit down and really talk about finding better balance, he promised. Maybe we can plan a vacation, just the two of us, somewhere without cell service. The promise felt as hollow as all the others he'd made over the years. A vacation would be lovely, but it wouldn't address the fundamental issue that his career would always take precedence over their relationship, that Victoria's needs would always be more urgent than hers, that her role would always be to accommodate rather than to be accommodated. After hanging up, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She wouldn't wait for David to return and renegotiate their relationship dynamic. She wouldn't hope for changes that would require him to fundamentally alter his priorities and behavior patterns. Instead, she would use this time apart to rediscover who she was independent of his ambitions and expectations. She started by rearranging their apartment, moving furniture to create space for a proper design studio in what had been David's secondary office area. She set up a drafting table, organized her art supplies, and created a workspace that reflected her aesthetic preferences rather than his corporate image requirements. The physical act of claiming space for her own creative work felt revolutionary after years of subordinating her needs to his. For the first time in their marriage, Sarah was making decisions about their shared space based on her own needs rather than his preferences. Ladies, if you're watching this and you've ever felt like Sarah, like you've been living in someone else's shadow for so long that you've forgotten what your own light looks like, what happens next is going to inspire you, because Sarah is about to discover that the woman she'd been before she started shrinking herself was stronger, more capable, and more deserving of love than she'd ever imagined. The transformation was about to begin, and it would be more dramatic than anyone, including Sarah herself, could have predicted. The phone call that would change everything came on a Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after David left for Jacksonville. Sarah was sitting in her newly arranged design studio, sketching ideas for a sustainable community garden project, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell. The voice was warm, professional, with just a hint of a Southern accent. "This is Caroline Martinez from Blue Ridge Eco Resorts. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time, but I got your name from Patricia Chin at the Charlotte Botanical Gardens. She said you might be exactly what we're looking for. If you're just joining us, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Sarah's about to make a decision that will transform her entire life. And ladies, if you've ever wondered if it's possible to start over at 45, you're about to find out." Caroline explained that Blue Ridge Eco Resorts was developing a luxury, sustainable retreat center in the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina. They needed a lead landscape designer who understood both environmental stewardship and high-end hospitality, someone who could create spaces that felt both luxurious and authentic, sophisticated and sustainable. "We've been looking for months," Caroline continued, "but most designers either understand sustainability or luxury, not both. Patricia showed me your portfolio from the Henderson Showcase, and your residential transformation project is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. "Tell me more about the project." "It's a 40-acre site in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about an hour from Asheville. We're planning 12 luxury cabins, a central lodge, and extensive walking trails, all designed to integrate seamlessly with the natural landscape. The goal is to create a destination that allows guests to experience the beauty of the mountains while maintaining 5-star comfort and minimizing environmental impact." As Caroline described the project, Sarah found herself taking notes, her mind already racing with possibilities. This was the kind of work she dreamed about in graduate school. Large-scale landscape design that could make a real difference, both environmentally and aesthetically. The position would be based in Asheville. Caroline added. We'd provide relocation assistance and a very competitive salary package. Plus, there's potential for equity participation if the project succeeds. Sarah's pencil stopped moving. Based in Asheville. Full-time, yes? Is that a problem? For most people, the answer would have been obvious. Sarah had a life in Charlotte, a husband, a home established routines. But as she sat in her tiny design studio, the first space she'd claimed for herself in years, she realized that what she had in Charlotte wasn't really a life at all. It was an elaborate performance of being someone else's supporting character. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, I hope you'll seriously consider this opportunity. From what Patricia tells me, you're exactly the kind of designer who could turn this project into something truly special." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her studio for a long time, staring at her sketches of community gardens and sustainable residential designs. For 3 years, she'd been creating pleasant but uninspiring projects for clients who wanted beauty without challenging their conventional ideas about what landscapes should look like. Now someone was offering her the chance to work on exactly the kind of innovative, meaningful projects she'd always dreamed of. The catch, of course, was that accepting would mean leaving Charlotte, leaving the apartment she'd shared with David for 5 years, leaving the life they'd built together, even if that life had gradually become more his than theirs. She called Patricia Chen that afternoon. Patricia had been a mentor during Sarah's early career, someone who'd recognized her talent and encouraged her to pursue challenging projects. They'd stayed in touch over the years, though Sarah had been embarrassed by how little she'd accomplished professionally since moving to Charlotte. "Sarah, I'm so glad you called. Did Caroline reach you?" "She did. Patricia, this sounds like an amazing opportunity, but I have to ask, why did you recommend me? I've been doing residential work for years. This project is so much bigger, so much more complex." Patricia's laugh was warm and knowing. "Sarah, honey, you've been hiding your light under a bushel for too long. I remember your graduate thesis, your innovative approach to urban renewal. You didn't lose that talent just because you've been working smaller projects. If anything, you've probably gained practical experience that will make you even better at large-scale design." She paused, and Sarah could hear the gentle concern in her voice. "Besides, from what I can tell you, need this project as much as it needs you. Sometimes we have to take a leap of faith to rediscover who we really are." That evening, Sarah researched Asheville and the Blue Ridge Mountains online. What she found surprised her. Far from being a rural backwater, Asheville had become a thriving center for sustainable living craft industries and innovative design. The city was home to numerous environmental organizations, cutting-edge architects, and businesses that prioritized social responsibility alongside financial success. The mountains themselves were breathtaking, rolling peaks covered in ancient forest, clear streams, and an ecosystem that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. It was exactly the kind of environment that would inspire the innovative, sustainable design work Sarah had always wanted to do. But it was also a 3-hour drive from Charlotte, from the life she'd built with David, from everything familiar and secure. David called that night from Jacksonville sounding exhausted and frustrated. The Henderson Group meetings were dragging on. Victoria was micromanaging every detail, and he had no idea when he'd be able to return home. "I'm sorry this is taking so long," he said, though his apology sounded perfunctory. "Victoria wants to make sure we get every detail perfect before we present the revised proposal." "How are you doing?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. "You sound tired." "I am tired. These 18-hour days are killing me. But if we can save this account, it'll be worth it." Victoria's hinted that there might be partnership opportunities for me if we pull this off. Partnership opportunities. Even now separated by distance and conflict, David was focused on advancing his career, on impressing Victoria, on climbing the next rung of the corporate ladder. David, Sarah said carefully, I need to tell you about something. I've been offered a job. She explained about Caroline's call about the Blue Ridge Eco Resorts project, about the opportunity to lead landscape design for a major sustainable development. David's response was immediate and dismissive. Asheville, Sarah, that's basically career suicide. What kind of serious design work could possibly be happening in some mountain town? You'd be throwing away everything we've built here. The casual cruelty of his assessment, the automatic assumption that anything outside his urban corporate world was inherently less valuable, crystallized the fundamental incompatibility between their world views. David measured worth by prestige and salary figures. Sarah was increasingly drawn to meaning and creative fulfillment. I haven't decided anything yet, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized that wasn't entirely true. Something inside her had already begun to shift toward this new possibility. Good, because it would be completely irrational to consider leaving Charlotte just when my career is really taking off. If Victoria makes me partner, we could finally afford that house in Myers Park we looked at. We could start thinking about expanding our family. The casual assumption that she would want to expand their family while he expanded his career responsibilities, the expectation that a larger house would compensate for an increasingly absent husband, revealed how little he understood about what she actually needed for happiness and fulfillment. I need to think about this, David. This is the kind of opportunity I've been waiting for my entire career. What we've been waiting for is for my career to reach the point where we have real financial security. Don't throw that away for some hippie ecotourism project in the mountains. After he hung up, Sarah sat in their quiet apartment and realized that David's reaction had made her decision for her. His inability to see her professional opportunity as anything other than a threat to his plans, his assumption that her career should remain secondary to his dismissal of environmental design as somehow less worthy than corporate consulting. All of it confirmed what she'd been trying to ignore for months. They didn't want the same things. They didn't share the same values. And they certainly didn't have the same vision for what their life together should look like. Sarah called Caroline the next morning and accepted the position. I'm so thrilled. Caroline's excitement was infectious. When can you start? We're eager to begin the design phase as soon as possible. I'll need 2 weeks to arrange things here in Charlotte, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Will that work? Perfect. I'll email you the relocation package information and some preliminary site surveys. Sarah, I have a good feeling about this. I think you're going to love working in the mountains. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal and liberating in equal measure. Sarah gave notice at Henderson and Associates, where her boss seemed more confused than disappointed by her departure. She'd been such a reliable, undemanding employee that he'd apparently assumed she'd stay indefinitely. Asheville, he said, echoing David's dismissive tone. Well, I suppose if you want to do nature stuff, that's the place for it. The condescension in his voice reminded Sarah of how little her current work challenged or inspired her. She'd been so focused on being accommodating, on not making waves, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to pursue work that actually mattered to her. Finding a place to live in Asheville proved surprisingly easy. Caroline connected her with a local real estate agent who specialized in rentals for people relocating to the area. Within 3 days, Sarah had secured a furnished cabin about 20 minutes from the project site, a small but charming space with a stone fireplace, wide windows overlooking the mountains, and a wraparound porch perfect for morning coffee and evening sketching. The cabin was everything their Charlotte apartment wasn't. Warm instead of sleek organic, instead of artificial, peaceful instead of status conscious. Standing on the porch during her first visit, surrounded by the sounds of wind in the trees and birds calling to each other, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. This is it, she told the real estate agent signing the lease on the spot. Packing up her belongings in Charlotte was more emotional than she'd expected, not because she was attached to their expensive furniture or carefully curated art collection, but because each item represented a choice she'd made to accommodate David's preferences over her own. The minimalist dining table he'd insisted on, even though she preferred warmer, more traditional styles. The abstract paintings that looked sophisticated but left her cold. The entertainment center sized to accommodate his extensive collection of business books and leadership memoirs. Sarah found herself packing only the items that reflected her own taste. Her design books, her art supplies, her collection of botanical prints, the handmade pottery she'd collected over the years, but never displayed because it didn't fit David's aesthetic. Everything else, the expensive furniture, the status symbol electronics, the carefully curated image of success, she left behind. If David wanted to maintain that lifestyle, he could figure out how to do it on his own. The drive to Asheville took her through countryside she'd never really noticed during their occasional weekend trips to the mountains. Rolling hills covered in hardwood forests, small towns with tree-lined main streets, farms where horses grazed peacefully in pastures bordered by stone walls. As she drove higher into the mountains, Sarah felt the tension she'd been carrying for years begin to ease. The air smelled cleaner, the sky looked bigger, and the pace of life visible in the small communities she passed seemed more human, more sustainable than the frantic energy of Charlotte's corporate corridors. Her cabin was even more perfect than she'd remembered. The previous tenant had left behind a collection of locally made pottery and a small library of books about mountain ecology and sustainable living. The kitchen was tiny but functional with a window over the sink that framed a view of the surrounding forest. That first evening, Sarah sat on her porch with a glass of wine and watched the sunset behind the mountains. The silence was profound. Not the empty quiet of loneliness, but the full quiet of a place where she could finally hear her own thoughts without the constant background noise of someone else's demands and expectations. She called her sister Emma that night. "I did it," she said simply. "I moved to Asheville." "Oh, Sarah." Emma's voice was warm with pride and concern. "How are you feeling? Are you scared?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "But also excited. I haven't felt excited about anything in so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like." They talked for an hour, Emma offering both practical support and emotional encouragement. "You know," Emma said near the end of their conversation, "Tom and I have been worried about you for years. You seem to be disappearing into David's life, losing yourself bit by bit. I'm proud of you for choosing yourself." The next morning, Sarah drove to the Blue Ridge Eco Resorts project site for her first official day of work. The 40-acre property was even more beautiful than Caroline's description had suggested. Rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers, mature hardwood forests, a clear stream that meandered through the property, and views of the Blue Ridge Mountains that took her breath away. Caroline met her at the site entrance, along with two other team members, Marcus Thompson, the project architect, and Janet Williams, the general contractor. All three were close to Sarah's age, experienced professionals who had chosen to work on sustainable projects because they wanted their work to make a positive difference. "Welcome to paradise," Caroline said, gesturing toward the mountains. "Ready to create something amazing." The next several hours were the most professionally fulfilling Sarah had experienced in years. Walking the property with Marcus and Janet, she found herself thinking like a landscape architect again, analyzing topography, studying how water moved across the land, observing which areas received the most sunlight at different times of day. "The key," Marcus explained as they stood on a ridge overlooking the entire site, "is to make it feel like the cabins grew here naturally, like they've always been part of the landscape." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. We'll want to cluster them in the areas that are already partially cleared, use the existing trees for privacy and wind protection. The walking trails should follow the natural contours of the land, maybe incorporate some of the old logging roads. Exactly, Janet said, and we want to use as many local materials as possible: stone from the mountain quarries, timber from sustainably managed forests in the region. For the first time in years, Sarah was working with people who shared her values, who understood that good design wasn't just about aesthetics, but about creating spaces that enhanced both human experience and environmental health. The project timeline was ambitious. They wanted to break ground on the first phase within 6 months, with the entire development completed within 2 years. It was the kind of challenge that would have intimidated the accommodating, self-doubting version of Sarah who had lived in Charlotte. But standing on that mountainside surrounded by professionals who respected her expertise and valued her input, she felt capable of anything. That evening, she called David to let him know she'd arrived safely and started her new job. He was still in Jacksonville, still dealing with the Henderson Group crisis, still waiting for Victoria's approval on every decision. "How's the mountain retreat thing going?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to report that she'd made a terrible mistake. "It's incredible, David. The site is beautiful, the team is brilliant, and the project is exactly the kind of work I've always wanted to do." "That's good," he said, though he didn't sound particularly pleased. "Look, Sarah, I've been thinking, maybe we rushed into this separation. Maybe I was too quick to dismiss your concerns about work-life balance. When I get back to Charlotte, why don't we try couples counseling, see if we can work things out?" Sarah looked out her cabin window at the mountains, silhouetted against the evening sky. A few weeks ago, David's offer to consider counseling might have filled her with hope. Now it felt like an offer to return to prison. "I don't think counseling will help us, David. We want different things. We have different values. We define success differently." "Success is success, Sarah. Financial security, professional respect, a comfortable lifestyle. I don't understand why you're throwing all that away for some environmental fantasy." And there it was, the fundamental disconnect that no amount of counseling could bridge. David couldn't conceive of success that wasn't measured in dollars and status symbols. He couldn't understand that Sarah might prefer meaningful work over a high-salary creative fulfillment, over social recognition, authentic relationships over networking opportunities. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said quietly. "I'm finally choosing what I actually want instead of what I thought I was supposed to want." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into the Blue Ridge project with an energy and enthusiasm she'd forgotten she possessed. She spent her days walking the property, sketching design concepts, researching native plants and sustainable building techniques. Her evenings were spent in her cabin, refining her ideas and developing detailed proposals for how the resort could integrate seamlessly with its natural environment. The work was challenging in ways that her residential projects in Charlotte had never been. She had to consider not just aesthetics and functionality, but also environmental impact, guest experience, maintenance requirements, and seasonal variations. Every decision required careful thought and creative problem solving, but it was also deeply satisfying. For the first time in years, Sarah was using her full range of skills and knowledge. She was making decisions based on her professional expertise rather than trying to accommodate someone else's preferences. She was creating something that would last, something that would make a positive difference in the world. The Blue Ridge community welcomed her with a warmth that surprised her. Her neighbors, a mix of longtime mountain residents and newcomers like herself, who had chosen the area for its natural beauty and slower pace of life, were genuinely interested in her work and eager to share their knowledge of local ecology and sustainable living practices. Helen and Robert Sullivan, a retired couple who lived in the cabin next to hers, became particularly good friends. Helen had been a teacher for 30 years, Robert a master carpenter who specialized in furniture made from locally sourced wood. They'd moved to the mountains 5 years earlier, seeking a simpler life focused on craft community and environmental stewardship. Store-bought furniture looks the same everywhere, Robert explained one evening as they sat on Sarah's porch, admiring a rocking chair he'd made from mountain cherry. But when you use materials from the place where something will live, it belongs there in a way that factory pieces never can. His philosophy resonated with Sarah's approach to landscape design. She was learning to work with the mountain's natural rhythms and materials, creating spaces that felt like they had always been there, rather than imposing her vision on the landscape. Helen became a mentor in the art of mountain living. She taught Sarah how to identify edible plants, how to read weather patterns in the cloud formations over the peaks, how to can vegetables from the garden she was helping Sarah establish behind her cabin. "The mountain teaches you patience," Helen said one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. "Things grow in their own time here. You can't force them. You can only create the conditions for them to flourish." Sarah realized Helen was talking about more than plants. She was talking about the kind of personal growth that required time, space, and the right environment to flourish. For the first time in years, Sarah had all three. The physical demands of mountain living also began to change Sarah in unexpected ways. In Charlotte, she'd maintained her fitness through expensive gym memberships and carefully scheduled workout classes. Here, physical activity was integrated into daily life through practical necessity and natural opportunity. Her cabin was heated primarily by a wood stove, which meant learning to split firewood and maintain consistent heat through careful tending. The process was initially frustrating and inefficient, but Robert patiently taught her the techniques his grandfather had passed down to him. Soon, Sarah found herself looking forward to the evening ritual of preparing the stove for overnight heating, appreciating the immediate cause and effect relationship between her efforts and her comfort. Walking became her primary form of transportation to the project site and her preferred way of exploring the surrounding area. Her body adapted to the constant low-level physical activity, developing a functional strength that felt more satisfying than the artificial challenges of gym equipment. Most significantly, Sarah's relationship with time began to shift in fundamental ways. In Charlotte, her schedule had been dictated by David's meetings, his travel requirements, his need for domestic support during stressful periods. Here, she discovered the luxury of following natural rhythms rather than artificial deadlines. She woke with the sunrise and went to bed not long after sunset, her body automatically adjusting to seasonal changes in daylight. She ate when she was hungry, worked when she felt creative, and rested when she was tired. The project had its own timeline, of course, but it was based on construction realities and seasonal weather patterns rather than arbitrary corporate pressures. This flexibility allowed her creativity to flourish in ways it hadn't for years. Design solutions emerged organically from careful observation and patient consideration, rather than being forced through deadline pressure. The resort cabins she was designing felt authentically connected to their site because she had time to understand that site deeply, to notice subtleties that would have been invisible under her old, rushed timeline. 2 months into her new life, Sarah received a call that would test her resolve. David was finally returning to Charlotte, and he wanted to visit Asheville to see what she'd been up to. "I need to understand what's so special about this place," he said, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Maybe if I see it for myself, I'll understand why you left everything behind." Sarah agreed to the visit, though she felt more nervous than excited about showing David her new life. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, but she also knew that he would see the mountains through the lens of his own values and priorities. When David arrived the following weekend driving his expensive sedan up the winding mountain roads, Sarah saw her new world through his eyes for the first time. The rustic cabin that had felt like a sanctuary to her probably looked primitive to someone accustomed to urban luxury. The slower pace of life that had been healing for her might seem boring to someone addicted to corporate drama. But she was determined to show him the beauty and meaning she'd found in the mountains, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he might understand why she'd chosen this life over the one they'd built together. What happened during that visit would determine whether there was any possibility of reconciliation, or whether Sarah's new life would mean the permanent end of their 20-year marriage. David's silver BMW looked as out of place winding up the mountain road to Sarah's cabin as a Wall Street executive would look at a farmer's market. Sarah watched from her porch as he navigated the final curve, his expensive luxury sedan struggling with the gravel driveway that her practical Honda had learned to handle with ease. For those of you who've been following Sarah's journey, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. The woman who had been abandoned at a train station was about to face the man who abandoned her. But now she was standing on her own ground, living her own life, and about to discover just how much she'd truly changed. David emerged from his car, wearing what Sarah recognized as his version of casual attire. Designer jeans that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, hiking boots that had clearly never touched actual dirt, and a carefully distressed t-shirt that carried a price tag higher than many people's daily wages. Everything about his appearance screamed expensive taste to urban observers, but would mark him as obviously out of place to anyone familiar with genuine mountain living. Sarah walked down from her porch to greet him, conscious of her own transformation as she approached. Her clothes were chosen for comfort and practicality rather than impression management. Sturdy work boots that showed honest wear, jeans softened by actual use, and a flannel shirt that she'd bought at the local hardware store. Her hands bore the calluses of someone who regularly used tools and handled materials, and her demeanor carried the confidence of someone who had built a life that reflected her authentic values. "Sarah," David said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty she'd rarely heard before, "you look different." "I am different," she replied simply. "Come inside. Let me show you what I've been working on." The tour of her cabin and studio served as a tangible demonstration of how completely her life had changed. David examined her design work with the same analytical approach he brought to business problems, clearly struggling to reconcile the quality and scope of her projects with his preconceptions about rural professional opportunities. Her drafting table was covered with detailed plans for the resort development, architectural drawings, botanical surveys, sustainability reports, and artistic renderings that showed how the completed project would integrate seamlessly with the mountain landscape. The walls displayed photographs of the construction progress letters from environmental organizations praising the project's innovative approach, and articles from design magazines that had featured her work. "This is impressive," David admitted grudgingly as he studied the renderings. "I had no idea you were involved in projects of this scale." He picked up a folder containing correspondence from other developers who had reached out about potential collaborations. "But surely you could do this kind of work from Charlotte with better clients and higher fees." His inability to understand that Sarah might prefer working with environmentally conscious clients over purely profit-driven ones, that she might value creative freedom over higher fees, that she might choose to live in the mountains because she loved them, rather than despite their limitations, revealed the fundamental gap between their values that no amount of conversation could bridge. "David," Sarah said gently, "I'm not doing this work despite living in the mountains. I'm doing it because living here has allowed me to become the designer and the person I was always meant to be. This isn't a compromise or a temporary arrangement. This is the life I've chosen because it reflects who I actually am." The conversation that followed lasted most of the evening and covered years of accumulated misunderstandings, resentments, and incompatible expectations. David genuinely seemed to believe that their problems could be solved through better communication and more structured compromise, as if their fundamental differences were matters of logistics rather than core values. He proposed arrangements that would allow Sarah to maintain some mountain projects while returning to Charlotte's schedules that would give her more independence while preserving their social and professional connections, financial structures that would treat her work as more equal to his while maintaining his ultimate authority over their major life decisions. Each proposal revealed his continued inability to see Sarah as an independent person with legitimate preferences that might conflict with his own. In his mind, she was still someone whose role was to adapt to his choices, rather than someone whose choices deserved equal consideration. "I've been thinking about what you said before I left for Jacksonville," David said as they sat on her porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "About wanting me to choose you over work sometimes. I think I can do better with that balance." "What would that look like?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his answer. "Well, I could set boundaries with Victoria. Maybe not take calls after 8 p.m. or on weekends unless it's a real emergency. And I could make sure to block off time for important family events. Your birthday, our anniversary, things like that." Sarah listened to his proposal with growing sadness. Even his attempt at compromise revealed how little he understood about what she actually needed. He was offering to schedule her into his existing priorities rather than questioning whether those priorities were healthy or sustainable. "David, do you hear yourself? You're talking about blocking off time for our relationship as if I'm a client meeting that needs to be fit into your calendar. That's not what partnership looks like." "I don't understand what you want from me, Sarah. I'm offering to make changes to find better balance. Isn't that what you asked for?" "I asked for a husband who would choose me because he wanted to, not because he scheduled himself to. I asked for a partner who would see my dreams as worthy of support, not just when convenient for his timeline." As the evening wore on, and David realized that his persuasion attempts weren't working, his tone shifted from confident negotiation to frustrated accusation. Sarah was being selfish. He claimed prioritizing her personal whims over their marriage commitment. She was being unrealistic about the long-term viability of her mountain business. She was throwing away everything they'd built together for a lifestyle that would ultimately leave her isolated and professionally marginalized. "You're choosing trees and mountains over a real life with real opportunities," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of dismissive certainty that had characterized too many of their conversations over the years. When this rural fantasy loses its novelty, when you realize what you've given up for the sake of playing house in the woods, it'll be too late to rebuild what we had. His words crystallized everything that was wrong with his perspective and everything that was right with her choices. David saw her love for the mountain landscape as superficial preference rather than genuine compatibility with her values. He saw her professional success as temporary novelty rather than sustainable accomplishment. He saw her happiness and fulfillment as illusion rather than the natural result of finally living authentically. "You're right that I'll never be able to rebuild what we had in Charlotte," Sarah replied calmly. "But that's because I don't want to rebuild it. What we had wasn't working for me, David. It wasn't making me happy or helping me grow or allowing me to contribute my best work to the world. What I have here does all of those things." David left the next morning without the reconciliation he'd expected, without the compromise he'd been willing to negotiate, and without any real understanding of who Sarah had become during their time apart. As she watched his BMW disappear down the mountain road, struggling to navigate the curves that had become second nature to her, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure rather than loss. The woman who had once defined herself through his approval was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't compromise her authentic self for anyone else's comfort or convenience. That afternoon, Sarah called her lawyer to begin divorce proceedings, ready to officially end a marriage that had ended emotionally long before David's visit. She was finally free to build a future that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own choices and reflecting her own values without the constant negotiation and accommodation that had defined her previous life. The mountains had given her more than a new career and a new home. They had given her back herself. And that gift was worth more than any compromise or reconciliation could ever be. But Sarah's story wasn't over. What happened next would prove that her transformation was not only complete, but about to be recognized in ways she never could have imagined. 3 years after David's failed reconciliation visit, Sarah stood backstage at the Atlanta Convention Center, adjusting her jacket and looking out at an audience of over 800 sustainable design professionals from across the country. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was back in Georgia, the state where her transformation had begun at that train station. But now she was here as the keynote speaker for the National Sustainable Design Awards. If you've been following Sarah's incredible journey from abandoned wife to award-winning designer, you know this moment has been building for 3 years. And ladies, what happens next is going to give you chills. The Blue Ridge Eco Resort had exceeded every expectation. What had started as a single development project had evolved into a model for sustainable luxury hospitality that was being studied and replicated across the country. The resort had won numerous environmental awards, been featured in Architectural Digest and Travel and Leisure, and maintained a year-round occupancy rate of 95%, with a waiting list stretching 6 months out. More importantly for Sarah, the project had established her as a leading expert in sustainable landscape design. Her innovative approach to integrating luxury accommodations with environmental stewardship had attracted attention from developers, architects, and environmental organizations nationwide. She now consulted on projects from Colorado to Maine, had published articles in major design publications, and was working on a book about sustainable hospitality design. But the real measure of her success wasn't the awards or recognition, it was the life she'd built. Sarah had purchased a larger property outside Asheville, where she designed and built her own sustainable home using many of the principles she'd developed for the resort. She had a thriving practice, meaningful friendships, and a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for decades. Her assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had driven down from Asheville to attend the awards ceremony. Jennifer was a young landscape architect who had sought out Sarah specifically because of her reputation for innovative environmental design and her commitment to mentoring other women in the field. "I can't believe you're nervous," Jennifer said as they reviewed Sarah's speech notes one final time. "You've been doing this work for 3 years. You know more about sustainable luxury design than anyone in that audience." "It's not the expertise I'm nervous about," Sarah replied, looking out at the gathering crowd. "It's being back in Georgia. This is where everything started for me." As if summoned by her words, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure in the audience. David Patterson was there, presumably attending as part of his continued work in corporate consulting. He looked older than his 47 years, his hair showing more gray than she remembered his posture, carrying the weight of someone who had spent too many years chasing other people's approval. For a moment, Sarah felt the old familiar flutter of anxiety that had once accompanied any interaction with David, but it passed, quickly replaced by something that surprised her, a feeling of genuine compassion for the man who had once been her husband. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference organizer announced, "please welcome this year's keynote speaker, Sarah Mitchell, Principal Designer of Blue Ridge Eco Resorts and winner of this year's Innovation in Sustainable Design Award." The applause was warm and sustained as Sarah walked to the podium. She looked out at the audience, designers, architects, developers, and environmental advocates who had chosen to attend a conference about sustainable design because they believed, as she did, that beautiful spaces could also be responsible spaces. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. I was a 45-year-old woman who had spent 20 years making herself smaller so that someone else could shine brighter. I had convinced myself that supporting someone else's dreams was the same as living my own. She paused, letting her eyes find David in the audience. He was watching her intently, his expression unreadable. I want to talk to you today about what I learned when I finally found the courage to choose myself, not selfishly, but authentically. When I decided to build a life that reflected my values, rather than accommodating someone else's vision of what my life should look like. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah spoke about the Blue Ridge Project, about sustainable design principles, about the business case for environmental responsibility. But woven throughout her technical presentation was a deeper message about the importance of authentic living, about the courage required to pursue meaningful work, and about the unexpected rewards of choosing purpose over prestige. Too often, we accept limitations on our creativity, our ambitions, and our potential because we're afraid that pursuing our authentic vision might require leaving behind security or comfort or approval, she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had made that choice and lived to tell about it. But true success, the kind that sustains us over decades rather than just quarters, comes from aligning our work with our deepest values, even when that path looks different from what others expect. The response was overwhelming. Sarah received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, followed by a rush of people wanting to discuss collaboration opportunities, speaking engagements, and consulting projects. Publishers approached her about expanding her keynote themes into a book about sustainable career development. Several universities invited her to develop curriculum for graduate programs in environmental design. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. As the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself face to face with David for the first time since his visit to Asheville. "Sarah," he said quietly, "that was incredible. I had no idea you'd achieved all this." He looked around at the lingering conference attendees, many of whom were still discussing her presentation. "I owe you an apology, not just for the train station or for all the times I chose work over you, but for never seeing who you really were, for never understanding what you were capable of." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine regret there for the first time. "Thank you for saying that, David. It means more than you know. I've been following your work online," he continued. "The articles, the awards, the recognition. You've built something remarkable here, and I realize now that I would have held you back from all of this if you'd stayed." There was a sadness in his admission that touched Sarah's heart. "You didn't hold me back, David. I held myself back. I made choices that seemed right at the time, but they weren't sustainable for either of us." "Are you happy?" he asked, and she could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice. Sarah looked around the convention center at the people still discussing sustainable design principles at the display boards, showing innovative projects from around the country, at Jennifer waiting patiently nearby with a folder full of new business inquiries. "I'm more than happy," she said. "I'm fulfilled. I'm challenged. I'm contributing to work that matters to me. I'm living as myself for the first time in decades." David nodded slowly. "I'm glad. You deserve that." He paused, then added with a rueful smile, "Though I have to admit I'm a little envious. I'm still chasing Victoria's approval, still trying to prove myself worthy of partnership. Some things never change." "They can change," Sarah said gently. "It's never too late to choose a different path." "Maybe," David said, though his tone suggested he wasn't quite ready to consider that possibility. "Take care of yourself, Sarah. You've become exactly who you were meant to be." As David walked away, Sarah felt the final closure of a chapter that had begun 3 years earlier at a train station in Atlanta. The woman who had been abandoned there had used that abandonment as liberation, transforming herself from someone who accommodated others' dreams into someone who created her own. The drive back to Asheville took Sarah through the same countryside she'd traveled 3 years earlier, but now she saw it through completely different eyes. The rolling hills and small towns that had once seemed like an escape from her real life now simply looked like home. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had attended the conference, from potential clients who wanted to discuss projects, from friends who had watched the live stream of her presentation. But the message that meant the most came from Emma, her sister, who had been one of Sarah's strongest supporters throughout her transformation. "Watched your speech online," Emma had texted. "Dad would have been so proud. You've become the woman he always knew you could be." As Sarah pulled into her driveway in Asheville, she saw Helen Sullivan waiting on her porch with a bottle of champagne and a wide smile. "How did it go?" Helen asked, though Sarah's expression had already given her the answer. "It went perfectly," Sarah said, accepting the champagne and settling into one of the rocking chairs Robert had made for her porch. "I think I finally understand what it means to be successful on my own terms." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset behind the mountains that had given Sarah back her life. The woman who had once been abandoned at a train station had become someone who would never again abandon herself for someone else's comfort or convenience. Sarah's phone rang with another business inquiry, and she smiled as she declined the call. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new chances to create meaningful work. But tonight, she was content to sit on her porch in the mountains, surrounded by the life she had built with her own hands and her own choices. The woman who had always been fine had finally learned the difference between being fine and being free. And she would never settle for anything less than complete authenticity again. Ladies, if Sarah's story has touched your heart, please share it with the women in your life who need to hear it. And remember, it's never too late to choose yourself, to pursue your dreams, and to build a life that reflects your authentic values, rather than someone else's expectations. The train that left Sarah behind at that station 3 years ago had actually been taking her exactly where she needed to go, toward a life of her own making, filled with purpose, passion, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living as your truest self. And that's Sarah's complete journey, from abandoned wife to award-winning designer who chose herself and built the life she'd always been meant to live. Thank you for following along with this incredible story of transformation and hope.